Hello and welcome back to the Football Heritage podcast. I'm your host, Rory Bryce, and today I'm joined by Caroline Parker from the Sell Before We Die campaign.
Hi, how are you? I'd love to say it's going well. Obviously we have some awful ownership issues, which I'm sure we'll get into, but the football aside, life isn't too bad.
Yeah, absolutely. I can completely agree with you on that one as well. Things aren't going too badly with the football aside. Now, for our listeners who aren't familiar with the name Caroline Parker, you might know her or some of her colleagues and associates more as the Sell Before We Die campaign, who are, of course, campaigning to save Reading Football Club at the moment. It's an absolute pleasure to have Caroline on. We've been wanting to do this episode for quite some time because it's quite important to us, in terms of saving football clubs and stopping mismanagement and so on and so forth. So today we're really going to be going over I suppose, the history and the aims and objectives of the campaign, the hopes and ambitions, and why campaigns like this are important to saving football clubs. And obviously, it's going to be a really, really great episode. I'm really looking forward to it. And, Caroline, as you said, the more people that know about Sail Before We Die and the campaign, the better.
Absolutely. And I think a big important message is we were quite naive to this before this happened with this owner. You know, you'd look on from afar at other clubs with these ownership issues and you think, God, that's really terrible. But it doesn't really hit home until it happens to your club. And then you are immediately more in tune and absolutely more empathetic with other football clubs. So part of the campaign message is very much the wider football has an ownership problem piece. There are multiple clubs we might be the top of the tree in terms of absolute crisis right now, but there's some people nipping at our heels. There's a lot of other teams in strife at the moment. You've got to look at Sheffield Wednesday and Southend and Scunthorpe and Morecambe and there's non-league teams. Nuneaton Borough have gone. And there's always another one bubbling away. So we've really tried to do our bit to look at and show and kind of really advertise what the gaps are in the football regulations and why these things are happening and what needs to change.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you listed a number of big names there. Scunthorpe was at the time, massive South End. Their problems have been pretty well broadcasted and especially on social media with the state of their pitch and the things on the run up to the start of the season. Swindon have just started their campaign. Birmingham have ownership issues. West Brom have just had a transfer, which is, absolutely fantastic for them. But again, it comes back to what you said. There is a larger ownership issue with football at the moment, and particularly within English football, I think it's safe to say there's a huge problem just with things going on and with mismanagement. But of course, Sell Before We Die are the campaign to save Reading Football Club from the ownership of Dai Yongge, who has been the owner for quite some time now. Reading is a club that I've got a little bit of a soft spot for due to I've got family that live in Reading. Cousin used to send me up jerseys, so it's always a club that I've kind of kept an eye on, if you'd like to say. But I think in terms of ownership issues at Reading, it stretches back for quite a wee while. But
It does. It
if we,
does.
yeah, yeah,
So to give you a bit of background, so John Madejski was a very trusted custodian, local businessman, done good, kind of your perfect owner, and he took what was a historic third slash fourth tier team in a kind of dilapidated but very much cherished ground, and propelled us into the championship and ultimately into the Premier League for a couple of seasons, and always well managed. John Madejski always said towards the end of his tenure he needed someone with deep pockets to come in. We very much hoped that Anton Zingarovic was a potential lauded owner in 2012 when we won our second Premier League title. That fell through because he didn't have the appropriate funding. We then had a Thai consortium owning the club. And that wasn't too contentious when you look back at it now. They then sold to Mr. Dai Yongge in 2017. Basically, I think the paperwork was completed or it was announced on the day of the playoff final or the day after the playoff final. So we were a penalty kick away from the Premier League again in 2017. Since then, it's been pretty much an unmitigated disaster. So he's taken terrible advice and spent a lot of money on players that aren't actually very good, extortionate wages, way out of kilter with profit and sustainability. And we've only really just gotten rid of a lot of those big contract players in the last 2 seasons. We've had multiple transfer embargoes. So we've been under a transfer embargo since 2019. So we have not been able to pay a transfer fee for 5 years nearly. With the conditions of that, you have limited agents' fees. You can't pay sign-on fees to players. So you are really restricted. You're fishing in a much smaller pool for players. So that's had a massive impact on our ability to remain competitive. We've had multiple winding up petitions served because of missed payments to HMRC. Players and staff have not been paid in full or on time on multiple occasions. And we were circling the trapdoor at the bottom of the championship for quite some time. And excuse me, and sadly, we finally fell through it last season, having spent pretty much 20 years in the top 2 tiers. And it's not so much that's disappointing. Obviously, it's disappointing. You want to be playing at the highest level, but unfortunately, it doesn't feel like we've hit rock bottom yet. We now find ourselves in a relegation battle in League One, having been in a relegation battle since the start of the season. More points deducted this season. That's the big one that I haven't mentioned. We've had 16 points taken off us in 3 seasons as well. So it has been an absolute car crash. And I think, the fans have had enough. There was a collective group of fans, some from the supporters trust, some from various fan groups, have all come together last summer and said, you know what, this is enough. We need to do something. We've got to try and apply some pressure to get this man out. So in June, Sell Before We Die was formed. So we're pushing 8 months now, and we're trying to do everything we can to get that man out of the club.
Yeah, you certainly are, and power and all the luck in the world to you, because it's certainly not an easy task for any fan group, any sort of fan cooperative, if you like, to come together and try and dethrone what has been an absolute horrible owner or
Mm.
conglomerate of owners is not easy, because they like to sink their teeth in, they like to dig their claws in and hold on to this in any which way they can. And I think from the outside looking in, people were looking at Reading and they're thinking, oh well, they used to be Premier League and then they used to be top of the Championship, they used to be mid-table, staple Championship club, right?
Mm.
And then all of a sudden they're at the bottom of the Championship. Oh well, you know what happens if they've had a bad season, and then all of a sudden at the bottom of League One. And I think that's when people start thinking, well, hold on a minute, like there's something not right here. And I think it's very clear from looking at it, as you said, players who aren't good enough have been given big contracts and big wages, but there's been some amount of asset stripping going on as well. The infrastructure of the club's been ripped out. Presumably, the ownership have been pocketing what's been left over of that, and not enough investment has been put back into the club out with of a playing perspective as well. And it's just you're absolutely right. It's just led to this car crash where the ownership has taken what was an absolutely massive and really, really historic club and just driven it right into the ground. And you know Reading are now teetering, I think it's safe to say, like really, really teetering on the brink. And obviously yourselves came along, formed in June, as you said, and had been campaigning since then. But it was really, I think, what brought quite a lot of attention to yourselves was the protest that took place. What was that? A month or so ago now, with the
Is this
pitch
the match
invasion.
abandonment? Yes.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I think match abandonment and affecting other teams and fans that are coming to your ground is not a nice place to be. But that said, sometimes it takes drastic action for the media to notice. Now, I hasten to add, this was a fan-led pitch invasion, so the original Sell Before We Die version of the protest was to invade the pitch at full time and sit in the centre circle at full time. Now, we knew there was always a risk that fans would do that earlier in the game, and so it proved. But I think everybody has their tipping point. I hate to keep saying this, but it's so true. Reading are such a mild fan base. They don't. This is a relatively timid. They will only take so much. I think any fan base will only take so much, and that was the absolute tipping point where enough was enough. We'd seen some players leave in January that we really didn't want to see leave, and then that's what played out. But it got some brilliant media attention. Now, I'm not necessarily advocating that that becomes a habit by any stretch, but we sometimes you have to pull the nuclear button, and the fans took it upon themselves to do that. And the media coverage it generated and the debate it's generated. Rick Parry has had to be very visible since that happened. We've seen him do a lot of press. There's a lot more noise around the regulator. So, I think all in all, was it worth it? Probably yes. But yeah, you're right. That was the big one so far that's garnered the most attention because it was so severe.
Exactly, and I completely agree with what you're saying. Pitch invasions and match abandonments when other fans are coming to your ground isn't where you want to be, but it's where at the moment you have to be. And it's what you have to do in order to bring attention to what's going on and to ultimately save your club. And I think, people will look at that and think, oh, it's shocking. But that's what happens, like you said, when people are pushed to a certain limit. That's what
Yeah.
happens when it gets as extreme as it's got. And it's not as if this was your first port of call, you know this has been going on for a number of years now, in a very long time. I mean, obviously that's probably one side of the extremes, but there's been another couple of protests beforehand. There's been some other actions. What kind of other stuff do you guys do to help raise awareness and help raise funds for the campaign? Because you're a very, very active group, and for English football, it's great to see because there's not an awful lot of groups that have been like that through the years. So, it's very impressive, and it's very much kind of laying the foundations for similar campaigns that have sort of started up in the last couple of months or so.
I think I have to say all of the fans at some level have been involved in it. So yeah, there's people that are in Sell Before We Die, of course, doing a bit more organisation and planning and some media and whatnot. But genuinely, when we've done some action, the fans have backed it in their droves. They've been really good. So protest action is always going to be divisive. You're always going to get those hardcore fans that are like, nope, everything will turn out well. I'm not going to protest. But where I think we've been effective is we've got different strengths in the group. So some are more PR and comms specialists, some people are money people, some people are good project managers. So we've got a really good range of professional skill sets in the group, and I think that's helped. But also genuinely there isn't really ego. People are in it because they want to save the club. They're not trying to make a name for themselves. They've all got that same core goal to get that man out of the club. And I think that as a team, we've worked really well as a group to just kind of farm different activities off. And I think, also we have worked really bloody hard. I just think this has genuinely been a full-time job, and I'm not exaggerating. I think on a good week we might do 20 extra hours a week, say, on top of full-time jobs and children and partners and all of that stuff. And it's a toll on your mental health. But I think we're so far in now, we can't give up. So I think I love all the people in the team that I'm working with. I think they've been great, and I didn't know any of them actually. So 8 months ago, I'd never met any of these people, which is kind of mad. Um, but I think there's just a collective united front with everybody against the owner, and I'd probably include the Reading staff and the players in that as well. I think the fan base is united. We've been on a relatively good run, last result aside, but it's there definitely a sort of us against Dai mindset, and I think that may well see us safe this season. But I guess with campaigns, the best advice I could give is just make a decision and stick to your principles. You will get heat on social media. People won't always agree, but just stick to your guns and just ride it out. And we've stayed the course. It was hard at the start getting that buy-in at the start because no one's done it before. But actually, the momentum grows and builds with each other protest, and we've got a decent amount of fan backing now. But to answer the question around protests, we've done a protest march. We've done tennis balls interrupting the game. We did a clown day the other week against Charlton. We've got a red card protest coming up imminently, where we're all holding up red cards for the rearranged Port Vale fixture. So we've got lots of political stuff. We're working with local MPs. We've got the leader of the council. We've actually got an assigned councillor from the local council working with us specifically. We've got roots into DCMS, the Supporters Trust, which I'm also a board member of. We speak to the EFL, the FSA. So we're trying to manage all of those stakeholder relationships with all the important parties as well as the fan action, because fundamentally it's the fan action that drives the media interest more than the political behind the scenes back office stuff, sadly. So you've got to keep one eye on that, because it's important to forge those relationships and put that pressure in the right areas. But at the same time, um, it's really important that we have a visible presence and the media are picking up on some of the activities that we're doing. So we don't ever really get to rest on our laurels. We're always planning the next thing and the next thing. So it's not for the faint-hearted, I'd say that.
No, not at all. It's all brilliant, and I think it's really good if anyone is listening whose club is going through this at the moment to hear this kind of thing, because if you're ever in the unfortunate position where you have to start a campaign to basically get rid of the ownership of your club, then you're thinking, my God, it's going to be me and a few other guys against this incredibly rich, incredibly powerful person. But you've just mentioned it there, and to kind of bring it full circle, everyone that's involved and everyone that's been a fan of Reading Football Club that's now involved in Sell Before We Die, they've got different professions, whether it's project management, whether it's legal issues, whether it's financial issues, whether it's social media and communication. All these things come together in such a perfect way because, everyone has their individual expertise and they're willing to use those to help out. And it's just such a great means of collective action to be able to take back what is rightfully the fans, and something that ultimately belongs to the fans. You're completely right as well, though, that it's not just a case of organising all these protests and fan things, because you need to be liaising with these stakeholders. You need to be communicating with them and you need to have them on side, importantly, so that they can give you support and so that you can support them and all these different things. And it's a complete balancing act at some points, um, having to, kind of juggle everything at once. So it's a monumental endeavour. And I just think it's really, really good for people to kind of hear what's involved in it and what's involved in basically taking on the ownership of your club, because at the end of the day, that's what you're doing, and it's what a lot of people are having to do with their clubs at the moment.
No, I mean, if you'd have said to me a year ago I'd be involved in this, I'd have said you were absolutely crazy. Not on my radar at all. But one of the big things we've managed to do is get the stadium protected as an asset of community value as well. So that's quite a big one, because that had lapsed and the council fast tracked it for us. The council have been fantastic, really supportive. So that means we've got various property and land laws and covenants protecting the stadium. So it can't just be bulldozed for real estate, it has to be used for sporting purposes. And there's a lot of restrictions now. So if anything underhand was to happen, because the stadium is not actually owned by the football club anymore, it's owned in a separate company, and we rent it from the owner. So that was always a worry for the fans. So the fact that the stadium has now been protected is a big tick, and that's something really tangible that has happened during the campaign, and it means that any nefarious intentions can't really go that far when it comes to the stadium now, which is great. But yeah, we don't want to be doing this anymore. We really want a new owner. We want him to just, he's a busted flush at Reading. No one wants him there. I don't think he really wants to be there. Just all we can do is just implore him to get a deal done and let everybody move on, really, because this is a not a fairy story. It's an absolute nightmare, and I think it's best for all parties involved that he just disappears as soon as possible, really.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, first of all, though, it's absolutely massive that you managed to secure protection for the stadium. First and foremost, not even given the context of what's going on with Reading and the ownership situation at the moment, just even being able to get that protection for a football stadium is incredible. So, seriously, hats off to you guys for that. That's absolutely fantastic, and it means that the ground's going to be protected for whoever knows how long now, as an asset for the community. And it means, as you said, that he can't do anything shady or dodgy with it when it comes to negotiating, and it will come to negotiating. So it's one of those things that at least will be safe. And obviously, I suppose with any fan campaign, a lot of our listeners might be thinking, well, you guys want to not necessarily take control of the club, but at the very least instigate this kind of transfer between the current ownership and a new owner. But just to get into the sort of in depths of it, what is the aims and objectives of Sell Before We Die? I mean, do you guys plan to have a seat at the negotiating table and kind of vetting new owners? Do you want any stake in the new ownership yourselves? I'm just quite interested to see, where you guys kind of sit with that side of things.
So, thankfully, this is a really easy question to answer. So, Sell Before We Die was set up with the absolute only aim of getting Dai Yongge to sell the club and transfer to somebody else. Now, part of some people in the Sell Before We Die team, including myself, are board members of the Supporters Trust at Reading, which is a separate organisation. Now, we are not expecting a seat at the negotiating table. But I think Sell Before We Die is very much the pressure group. It's the one that's going to try and take the action to push Dai Yongge to sell. If we get to a business as usual state where there is a new owner that comes in, some of the activity that's happening in the campaign will naturally go back to the supporters trust, because it'll be more the maintaining the relationship with the club, meeting the new owners. I think it's really important for the new owners to build that relationship with the supporters trust and try and be as transparent and open as possible. We've had really poor communication from the club for the whole of Dai's tenure. He hasn't spoken to the fans at all. That's another big red flag in terms of ownership. He's never really addressed the fans. So obviously you can't know everything, but I think at some level you need to communicate with your fan base if you own a football club. Now, I think some of these things will naturally go into the supporters trust remit, but as a trust, part your bread and butter is making sure you do your bit to make sure you've got a football club for fans to support, to try and protect it. So there is crossover there. So our aim is very much get Dai out, get a good custodian in. I think the baton then passes to the supporters trust in terms of building a relationship with that new owner and encouraging them to be transparent. But if any new owner was inquiring about the club and wanted to speak to supporters trust, the line is always open and people would be more than willing to talk to them. And I think building that structure and it was really important going forward, because we just haven't had that with the current tenure.
Definitely, a line of communication and transparency is absolutely vital, and also the ability to be accountable. Because if you're not being transparent yourself, then you're taking the fans' ability away to hold you to account. And I think in any new owner for Reading, that's going to be absolutely pivotal,
Mm.
um, to be able to do that. And I think it's going to be, well, I mean, I'm glad it's something that you guys basically have listed as one of your objectives. Because it's just something that's absolutely vital. Um, I mean, it's just, since June, as you said, it's been 8 months. It must have felt like a really, really quick 8 months, and obviously the problems at Reading have been going on long before that. I mean, was there any indication that it would come to this when Dai Yongge first took over? Was there any worries from the beginning? Did anyone know anything about this guy? Is he just, just quite curious to know if people kind of expected that this was going to happen, or if there was a bit of optimism when he took over instead?
I think if a new owner, just standard football, everyone looks for the best in football at the start, don't they? You get a new manager in, you get a new sign in, you get a new owner. There's always optimism at the start with anything new that's coming in, because you think, but then, it became apparent quite early on that he was kind of splashing the cash. And I think people's eyebrows were being raised, I'd say, sort of 2019, 2020, where we were spending way more than what our revenue was in terms of player wages, and actually it wasn't necessarily having a positive impact on the pitch. Some of these players were coming in on ludicrous money. They'd never played in the championship before. So it's a massive risk. And then obviously if they're earning the best contract of their life and they're on a 3 or 4 year deal and they're not very good, they're going to go out on loan, aren't they? They're not going to leave because they'll never get a contract like that again in their life. So, we had lots of situations like that. We had situations where, so yeah, I think people were starting to feel a bit uncomfortable with it towards the end of 2019-20 season, I'd say. That's when the warning signs were that we started breaching FFP, real question marks on not on how much we were spending and what we were spending it on. But I think, you can't, if a new owner comes in and decides they're going to have a crack at getting to the Premier League and buying some players, I think you'd be hard pushed to find any fan that says, "Oh no, no, don't do that. Don't invest in the in the playing squad." Of course they're not going to say that. Most new owners come in and probably throw a little bit of money about, but it was just the way in which it was done, what it was spent on. We've got a state-of-the-art Category 1 training facility now. He spent a fortune on that. Now, don't get me wrong, you want to have a good academy, you want to have a good training facility, but do you need something that's got all the bells and whistles and better than most Premier League facilities when fundamentally you're a championship club? And I think some of these things have just been a little bit excessive and just not sustainable. And now as a result, the cost base of the club is fundamentally a lot higher than what it was before he came in. And some of these decisions take years and years to reverse. And that's where we're seeing budget cuts, we're seeing redundancies, we've seen, all the big earners have left the payroll now, really playing wise. We're feeling the pinch. We're like Reading FC in austerity mode now. So it's but they were always a reasonably frugal club. They always lived broadly within their means before. So I think culturally it's probably a better fit for Reading fans. Historically we're a third or fourth tier team. They're not used to chucking big money about. I think it'd be quite a relief for a lot of Reading fans to get to some level of normality again. To be fair, we are getting there now. If you look at the playing squad and what they're spending on the players, it is a normal wage bill. There's nothing crazy on there anymore. Um, but the fact that we will remain under embargo for another year really restricts our ability to be competitive in the transfer market in all the windows because we can't pay any fees. So it's a sorry tale where someone bets the house on red and it comes up black, and it's happened time and time again. And I think that everyone's chasing that golden goose of the Premier League and the parachute payments, and I'm sure Reading won't be the last. You've got FFP, you've got the salary management protocol in League One and below. So I think EFL is probably a bit more ahead of the curve than the Premier League in terms of making sure people aren't spending silly money. Um, but with that carrot of the Premier League, you're always going to get a few thinking, "Sod it, I'll just go for it and worry about the fine later." Uh, so it's a tricky one. It's a tricky one.
Mm, it definitely is. And I think it's really important that you mentioned there, um, the parachute payments and things like that. So in a former job that I worked in, just in the line of work, we used to work with a couple of football clubs, and we worked with a football club who quite famously and very, very quickly and dramatically went from being in the Premier League to League One in the space of 1 or 2 seasons, right? However, when we went down to speak with them, they basically said they had to adjust the infrastructure of the club from being Premier League to League One in about 2 years and however many financial years. And they said people obviously don't see that side of things normally, but that's an incredibly difficult thing to do. You can't just do it overnight. In fact, you
No.
can't, it's not something you can just do in 6 months. And I suppose the threat is still there. If Reading end up in League Two, they're going to have to adjust from being Championship to League Two. I mean, that's still a huge, huge jump. It's still a huge, huge gap, and there's all these other different things that could just threaten everything else that's going on. But it's I think, and as you said as well, and of course, I don't speak for Reading fans by any means, but the way that it's going at the moment, if you did end up in League Two, but you had a new owner, presumably that would be a victory because, again, as you said, you'd be spending within your means. It would still be crap. Don't get me wrong. You'd suffer another relegation, but if you had a new owner and he was guaranteeing that he would get you back up to the Championship eventually, and you would spend within your means, then surely that would be a victory, even if a small one.
It's difficult. I ask myself this. We've often said this. Would you take survival, but Dai Yongge still being here for the start of next season, or would you take League Two, but he's gone? And I think pretty much most Reading fans would take the latter, League Two, and he's gone. Having said that, I think we've only lost 2 in 14 in the league. They've got a really good shot at staying up now. They've hit a decent run of form, so I think safety is within our gift now. We've got teams all around us, and we've got 4 of them at home. So you win, you take 9 or 10 from 12, and we're well on the way to safety. I think so. I think it's really difficult because I think another relegation would be disastrous for the club. And the problem you've got is if we were to go down this year, fundamentally buyers want to buy a League One club right now. Reading, they've got the fan base. They're right near a London airport. You know, we're in a good catchment. There's not that many professional. We're the only professional club in Berkshire. When Reading are doing well, that ground is full up. And actually, the hardcore supporters definitely increase numbers wise. We sell out away ends every week. So I think it's a really good investment proposition, and I do fear if we weren't to stay in League One, I think it would make it absolutely more difficult to sell the club, and I think the owner is proving to be fairly stubborn about what he wants for the club price wise. You know, the numbers he's hoping to get, he would just not get them if we were in League Two again, because it's less TV money, it's all of that stuff. Granted, it's not as big as a drop in revenue as it is from Championship to League One. That's the big drop. However, that said, it's still a drop, and I think as a fan, you've got to ask yourself, if you keep seeing your team getting relegated every season, it is going to affect your gate receipts. You can't expect it not to. You've then got the issue of having a Category 1 status academy in a fourth tier club. That, you know, that would be massive risk. It's already a risk, really. So there are really serious, unthinkable implications of us going down this year. So I really hope that we don't, and trying to remain optimistic. I'm just hoping that a deal is kind of ratified before the end of the season, with us securing our League One status, and we can look forward to 24-25 with some level of optimism. That's what I'm hoping for.
Yeah, I mean, again, as an outsider looking in, I think that's what everyone's hoping for, and you saw it as well. But the game that was abandoned with the pitch invasion and the protests and things like that, I can't remember what team it was, but the away fans were very supportive of you and in solidarity with what was going on, which was really, really good to see. And I think a lot of people are seeing what's going on. And because of the wider ownership issue, you're saying, well, you know, you're not the only ones that are in this, and we know how it feels. And I think from the perspective of a football fan, you know, there has to be a level of sympathy, because at the end of the day, there's a potential that your club's being lost. And I don't think I have to tell anyone how absolutely devastating it would be for the community if Reading was basically to cease to exist.
Oh, it's unthinkable. I mean, you really hope that doesn't happen. But, you know, I'm from Reading. I was born right round the corner from the ground. That is our football club in our town. It's not like I'm a kind of Man U or Liverpool fan from down south, of which I'm sure there's millions that watch them on a Sky Sports subscription. You know, this is a real part of local people's lives. They're going to watch it. And it's a massive part of the town. And it would be a huge loss. And um, it's devastating for John Medeski alongside many other people, because you know, fundamentally Reading were pretty much a top 30 club for 20 years. So it is quite a fall from grace if we were to go down again into League Two. But to go back to your point around the away fans, it was actually against Port Vale. Port Vale, I mean, there's been supportive, and then there's Port Vale fans. They were another level of supportive. They were actually getting involved in the chants, cheering the fans that were on the pitch, super supportive on social media afterwards. And they've got a legendary manager, John Rudge, and they wanted to raise 100,000, I think, for a statue. So they've been running this GoFundMe for years and years and years. So by way of an apology, the link to this fundraiser for this statue got shared, and within like 2 or 3 days, I think Reading had put like 4 or 5 grand in and just absolutely smashed it. And they basically can build the statue now. And I think Reading fans raised about £10,000 in about a week or something crazy. And so there's a bit of a love in between Reading and Port Vale fans, which is really nice. So it does show you that there is a bit of a soul in football somewhere. And I guess personally, I can't speak for all Reading fans, but the best bit about being in League One, it feels like every tier you go down is a bit more of an authentic experience. I just think they're real proper football fans. They're standing in the rain in a beaten old dilapidated stadium week in, week out, knowing they're probably not going to win, but they're going anyway because they love it and it's their team. And I think it's been, I don't know, it's just been quite an authentic experience, all of these old grounds and proper fans. I think I haven't. Yeah, I'd like us to not be 18th in the league, and I'd like us to be mid-table. But that aside, I actually think it's been quite a refreshing change, in some ways, to be in a different division, and I think in many ways, we were circling the drain in the championship for so many seasons. It was almost, in a weird kind of twisted logic, it was almost refreshing for it to finally happen and have something else to look at. Sadly, it wasn't a great reset, and we're also staring down the barrel of relegation. But we're on the up. But yeah, I just think, yeah, Port Vale couldn't say enough kind words about their fans. Unbelievable.
Yeah, I think you're completely right about, the sort of tier thing. You would rather, of course, you would rather not be staring down the barrel of another relegation. I get that, but the lower down the divisions you go, it feels purer.
Yeah.
It feels like proper football. Not to use that term, but it just feels about what's right instead of it being a bit soulless and a bit more touristy. And I know not all of the championships like that, but it's a bit different now. But it's just one of those things that you kind of enjoy a little bit more about it. But well, yeah, and I think that's another thing as well. Like you said, and like we've been talking about, it would be absolutely disastrous if Reading were to go under by any means. And obviously the club has all this history and all this heritage that has to be protected and has to be preserved for future generations of fans. And once the new owner does come in, do you have any plans, or you've kind of already said already, but I'm assuming that you would want the owner, and one of the conditions would be these things have to be protected and that these things have to be, sort of cherished and promoted, and it's not just something that he sees as, like a bargaining chip or anything like that.
I think we have to be real about what kind of owners own football clubs these days. It's not this fairy story of a local businessman done good. It's often a consortium of people. I think we have to accept that it needs to be run as a business, and I don't think any Reading fans are averse to that. We certainly don't want someone putting the very existence of the club at risk ever again. Um, I think Reading fans are rightly going to be very wary of any new owner coming in. We Reading fans aren't demanding, like I said before, we don't have conditions. All we expect is for them to run the club sensibly, and have good honest, open communication with the fan base, and that's it. I think Reading always did well where the team was greater than the individual, and they had a very good team ethos from right to the top, right to the bottom at every layer, right through to catering staff and everyone in between. And I think we need to get back to that sort of mentality. There's green shoots of that with this current playing squad. They've definitely got a fire in their belly. There's definitely a togetherness. They could have easily kept their heads down with the points deductions, languishing in the bottom four and given up. They've not done that. They've spectacularly turned their form around in the last 4 months nearly. And it's been really positive to see because fundamentally it's been a brand new team as well. That's what people need to remember. There's been some wholesale changes to that starting 11, compared to what we saw in the championship. So, obviously they need a little bit of time to settle in. The manager, I think it's fair to say, didn't have the best start. Tactically a bit shaky. Didn't really know who was the best in which position and what his favoured formations were. That also seems to have settled down. But yeah, we just want someone that's going to look after the club and treat it with respect. That really is it. And some communication on occasion with the fans will be most welcome. They're not Reading are not. Why aren't we competing for? Why aren't we getting promoted every season? We want the Premier League. They're realistic fans. So I think any owner coming in, hopefully sees what good potential the club's got because it absolutely has, and hopefully he's in a passionate fan base that's prepared to fight for the club because I think that's important. They're not troublemakers. There's absolutely the right motive here, and that is to make sure we've still got a club.
I totally agree with you. And when you put it like that, you think to yourself, it's it's not much to ask for. Just someone who's gonna look at the club and think, these are fans, these are good people, let's treat them right and treat them with respect. There really isn't much to ask for, but unfortunately, in this area of modern football, it's become something that's actually a bit of a rarity. amongst ownership, as I said, particularly in England, which is a shame. So, obviously things are going to come to a head eventually, and Sell Before We Die have been putting real pressure on the ownership. Has there been any signs of negotiation taking place anytime soon? Any signs that things might be changing a bit for the better off the park in respect to the ownership?
So we were told that the club was up for sale in October, right before one of the other protests, actually. And I think the deal was pulled at the 11th hour just before Christmas. And we don't know the ins and outs of it. Some of the information, obviously, we're not privy to. Now, we understand since the Port Vale Pits invasion, there is a clear understanding that the fans want him to go, and we are told that there is absolutely more appetite to sell the club and negotiations are ongoing. However, we have to treat this with a healthy dose of skepticism because whilst we're positive and it does feel like there has been a bit of a shift in that there is more appetite to sell from his part, we've been here before and he could change the terms and conditions at the 11th hour again. So we've got to be, we can't not carry on with what we're doing. We are getting updates. So the supporters trust is getting weekly updates from Nigel Howe, who is the main person on in the club dealing with the sale. I think some credible parties have been put forward. We need to see if what we want to hear is that a party's been chosen and now they're heading into exclusivity, because that would give you some indication that there's a desire on both sides to get something over the line. And we're not quite there yet. We're kind of every week that ticks by, we're hoping for a bit of positive news, but right now we don't really have anything concrete. So there are some positive signs, but until it's done, it's not done.
Yeah, spot on. So I'm guessing that until there is some more positive news and some concrete news, and until that news comes, then regardless of shift in tone and shift or feeling or whatever, it's just going to be business as usual for Sell Before We Die.
It is. I mean, we have to be really careful about what sort of action we take on now, because if we have any more abandonments, or we will get an immediate 3 points deduction. So, given that we're in a perilous state in the league table, we couldn't live with the fact that we would be potentially contributing towards a successive relegation. So that just doesn't sit right. One of the campaign messages has been support the team, not the regime, and we've always had to strike a balance because supporting the team is obviously easier when the team is doing well. That's just a given. So I think there is less appetite in the fan base to derail that at the moment, I would say, which is a good thing, and that's the right thing. Where it becomes tricky is if do we want to provoke the owner so that out of spite he doesn't sell the club or stops paying the bills or anything like that. So it's there's never a simple answer to some of this stuff. We very much have to take the campaign week by week and see what news we've heard, see what's happened, and then change or pivot our approach accordingly, depending with which way. What we don't want to do is jeopardize a sale. That would be the worst thing, because we're here to get him to sell. To sell the club, if we take action that contradicts that aim and actually ends up causing more bother, we wouldn't be able to live with that as a team, because every all the fans want the same thing. They might just disagree on the way in which you do it, but fundamentally we all want Dai gone. So yeah, it is business as usual. There's obviously the political back officey type stuff with the regulation has to carry on. That's a constant theme throughout. Fan action, we've got to be really careful with now. So we have to plan very carefully around what we do that gets attention but it isn't disruptive. And it's not as easy as people might think. When you've been planning various different stunts and campaigns month after month, it's difficult. It's not easy to keep planning things that you're going to get everyone behind, two, that you're going to get media attention for, and three, things that can be organized safely for fans, that you can turn around when you've all got full-time jobs. It is hard. It is very hard.
It's not easy whatsoever. And when you said there, support the team, not the regime. It's very reminiscent of what happened at Celtic in the kind of early 90s. Back the team, sack the board sort of mentality, you know. Not that it's an entirely similar situation, but you know, I think it's one point or another. Pretty much every football club will have gone through what Reading's going through at the minute, to different degrees and with different contexts, of course. But it's something that many generations of football fans will know all too well. And I think it's something that a lot of the people that we've spoken with, particularly in the last run of podcasts that we've done, those were people who had seen their football clubs die, basically. Some of them had come back, some of them hadn't, and you know, it was some really, really emotional stuff, particularly where Aldershot and Chester were concerned. Really, really horrendous stuff. And the same thing is happening with Reading, but of course with yourselves and to a lesser extent with Swindon, what's just happened at West Brom, there's fans making things happen, and there's this positive collective action that's happening to make sure that these teams don't go under. I mean, if Reading or West Brom or any team went under like that, it would be horrific. It would be devastating. These are massive clubs. They're historic clubs, and they've not been protected enough for it to get to this point. There has to be other things in place from the associations as well, so that this kind of thing stops happening. But you know, listen, that could be another podcast altogether. Um,
It sure could.
yeah. And one thing I wanted to ask you just before we finished up, is there any advice or anything that you would say to any other campaigns that are going on at the moment or that might happen in the future for, you know, people who want to do something similar and either instigate a buyout or want to save or even want to take ownership of their club? What would you say to them?
Oh, crikey. I mean, some of those I don't feel like I'm really well equipped to answer, particularly the ones about taking ownership of a football club, because to be clear, that isn't Sell Before We Die's remit. I think that might kill us all off if we had to do that. And I think funny you say that. There's a lot of people that have said, oh, we need to buy out the club. Can't we put a consortium together like Portsmouth have done and Exeter City have done? And it's in principle, it's a lovely, altruistic, great idea that fans own the club. The reality is, Reading is just too big a club now. Fan ownership models only work to a certain level of infrastructure, and I'm afraid, unfortunately, Reading probably has just tipped the balance where they're just that little bit too big for that model to work. Because yes, you've got to find the money to buy Die out in the first place, which won't be cheap, but you've got to accept that you're going to be running at ongoing losses every year as well. You know, you've got to, not necessarily big run losses, but you look at most championship teams, I think bar two or three of them, they're all running at a loss in the championship. It's just a question of how much. So, you know, whoever comes in has got to be prepared to be losing up to 5 million per annum in losses until they get back to the championship. So that's where a fan ownership model just doesn't necessarily work for Reading. I digress. So I can't give much advice on that. But what I would say is a campaign. I think you've just got to have your principles, your core principles of what you want to achieve, and really try and stick to that. And I think reach out and get support. You know, we had brilliant support from um, Fair Game, the FSA. I think Southend, their fan groups, All at Sea, and the Shrimpers Trust, they've been brilliant. Wigan Athletics Supporters Trust have been brilliant with us. Bolton have been fantastic. Port Vale, we've had some really good people put their hand up and say, look, we'll give you some advice. So I think just there's a lot of people out there. There's a lot of good people out there. So just don't be afraid to reach out to people. Like, you know, we've actually reached out and we've been helping the 1867 group, which is the Sheffield Wednesday protest group. So you know, it's we are all in it together. It is a collective thing, and I think the more people have that voice around changing regulation and football ownership, the better. So I think, you know, try not to take on too much. I think burnout with this is a real thing. I think it's really affected a lot of our mental health, because not only are you fighting with the fact that your football club's on fire, that in itself is quite devastating to see. You're then grappling with trying to keep fans happy in terms of, are we doing the right thing, yes or no? It's a constant worry in your head about, are we doing the right thing, and what would the fans think, you know? Then you're trying to fit all the stuff around, and it can get quite daunting. So I think if you've got a campaign team, just get as many volunteers as you can. divvy out the work so that you've all got little bits to look after, spread the load, because it is a lot of work. And I think looking back, we all went in so hard on it because we had to get that attention. But you get to month 8 and you're thinking, oh my goodness, it's really hard. And we've all got personal lives, and they've all taken an absolute battering since this started. That said, I wouldn't have changed it, and I'm so glad I did it. But I think just stick to your beliefs and your principles, get advice from people, and just be cute about what you do. Spend the most time on some stuff that's got the best impact. We ran an ad campaign. It was actually quite inexpensive for an ad van. We ran a football has an ownership problem round the Houses of Parliament. We went to the EFL office. We went to Dai's house. We went to his casino. We had loads of different ads on the ad van. And actually, in terms of media hit and bang for your buck, it was a really good VFM campaign. So I think definitely having some PR people in your team helps, because they're very cute about getting the socials up and getting the story out there without necessarily spending hours, weeks, months on things. So I think try and get some professional advice, get some good professionals together in a room, and just crack on. But we learn all the time. We're not experts. None of us did this. We don't know what we're doing. We're absolutely winging it. But we have learned a fair bit, I would like to think. But you've got to accept you will not please everybody, and you're always going to have your detractors and critics, and you have to just rise above that and just ignore it, really, because you can't let that grind you down. Most people in the main are supportive. They get the aim. So yes, strap yourself in, whoever's in a football campaign team, and good luck. That's all I'm going to say.
I think it's all excellent advice. But finally, and most importantly, this moment in time, what are you saying to Mr. Dai Yongge?
Leave. That's easy. That's easy.
That's
Please
easy.
go.
Get out. That's been the easiest question all day. Caroline, thank you so very much for coming on. It's been an absolutely fantastic insight into how to run a football campaign, the story of Reading, the story of Dai Yongge, or the whatever you want to call it, the horrible story, and just where this entire fiasco is taking you. And I think I speak for everyone when I say that everyone's hoping there's a positive outcome for Reading in the future. I mean, is there anything you'd like to say just before we sign off for this episode?
No, thanks for having me on. I think it's really nice to get the message around out the wider football community for those that don't know about it. But people forget that Reading is a 153-year-old club. We are one of the oldest clubs in the Football League. And I think the oldest club south of the Trent, I believe, which is it's quite a thing. Just because our history isn't in the Premier League, it's still quite a rich history, a long history. So if it can happen to us, it can happen to anyone. And I think it's so true that you are only one bad owner away from seeing something that's happened with us happen to your club. So I would never rest on, all these people that say, oh, we've got brilliant owners. They'd never do that. But those brilliant owners get old, they get tired, they get jaded, they can't stay forever. Then they're hoping and praying that they're selling to someone good, but you never quite know you're selling to somebody good. There's an element of luck and there's an element of trust involved when the baton changes hands, and all it takes is for it to fall into the wrong hands, and you end up like we've ended up. So I think if it's taught me anything, is to be very empathetic towards other clubs that have been through this or going through this, because I don't think we'd ever want to see this again.
I think you're spot on. You're only ever one bad apple away from not having a club to support, I think, is the really hard hitting truth of it. But once again, Caroline, thank you so much for joining me in this podcast today. And thank you to all of our listeners who tuned in for this episode as well. If there's a topic that you want us to cover related to football, history, or heritage, whether it's a club that's under threat of going defunct, a dodgy owner, or anything related to the kind of heritage topics we've discussed before, club cultures, identities, club histories, or or whether it's new clubs that are focused on the community and trying to make their own heritage and identity. Anything related to that, please get in touch. We're more than happy to have a chat with you to see if the idea that you have is a good fit for the podcast. You can contact us on X, that's @_footyheritage, and you can also email us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk. Please also check out the written content that goes up on our website, which is footballheritage.co.uk. Some fantastic stuff going up there from our contributors, so please go and have a read of that if you're able to, and support them if you can. But for now, Caroline, say goodbye.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me.
And it's a goodbye from me as well. We'll see you all again next week. Goodbye.